Galatians 2 verse 3, but even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. And I bring this verse out because of Paul's discussion on circumcision, which we already know from our studies of the book of Galatians. Circumcision plays a very important role in understanding the book, both from a socio-religious perspective as well as from a perspective of lifestyle, halakha. Let's read my comments. Paul says that Titus was not forced to be circumcised, right? Even though Titus was a Greek. And yet, if you remember from memory, in Acts chapter 16, Paul actually did circumcise Timothy, which I don't think Timothy was forced to be circumcised by Paul in Acts chapter 16. So let's play with this word force, right? My comments read, the key to understanding this particular verse is the force of the Greek word translated as forced. Pun intended, right? The Greek word force, which is anankadzo, which is translated by, let's see, footnote number 77 has, the TSBD, Thayers and Smith's Bible Dictionary, defines or shows anankadzo as to necessitate, to compel, to drive, to by force, by threats, etc. In other words, to compel is probably the word that we're familiar with in the English. And basically this word suggests, as I looked it up, it suggests that Titus, a Gentile believer, right? Paul says he was a Greek. He's a Gentile believer. He did not even wish to be circumcised at that time, even though it is a clear command of Torah, right? We know it's a command of Torah. You can read about it in Genesis 17, and you can read about it in Leviticus. I think it's Leviticus around chapter 6 or so. So we know that circumcision is a command, but many would say, well, of course he didn't get circumcised because he's a Greek. He's a Gentile. It's only for Jews. Well, maybe, maybe not. Let's keep reading. Why would Titus not wish to exercise his right to Torah as a full-fledged member of the community, right? He is a member of the Torah community, that is, he's a believer. Perhaps he was a green believer, right? You've met people who are brand new baby believers. Perhaps he was a seasoned believer with proper motives, right? We don't know for sure, but we do know that he declined. Remember, I say being with sha'ul, he was surely aware of the prevailing rabbinic halakha that Gentiles were not considered covenant members until after conversion. So, in the first century view, conversion of Gentiles into Jews took place for the purpose, ostensibly, supposedly, that is, to bring Gentiles into the covenant made with Israel. In other words, to turn them into Israelites, turn them into Jews. And supposedly, from this perspective, if a Gentile underwent physical circumcision, that sealed the deal, so to say. That was one of the final steps that it took to turn a Gentile into a legally recognized Jewish member of the Israelite group. So, because Titus traveled with Paul, I'm sure that he was aware of that particular perspective. Thus, I go on to say, Titus's motives for accepting or refusing circumcision at that time, I believe, were a reflection of his taking a stand with Paul to send the right signal to the newly formed Gentile faction within apostolic Judaism. Right? Let me finish reading the paragraph, and then I'll go back and explain any parts that seem to be unclear. I go on to say, I recommend that she see the additional thoughts involving Peter on 2:14 below. In other words, and we're going to talk about that tonight. We're going to keep talking about this idea. I think it's safe to assume that once the heat was off, circumcision would not present any problem for him personally. In other words, at the time that Paul was writing the letter, and because of the kind of the confusion in the Galatian communities about should we convert as Gentiles, should we take on Jewish identity, in addition to our belief in Yeshua, what should we do, And Paul, of course, strongly warning them not to go down the proselyte path for the wrong reasons. Then Paul's going to remove circumcision from their communities. And I think that's probably one of the reasons that that influenced Titus' decision. That sha'ul had Timothy, also considered a Greek by first century Jewish standards, circumcised in Acts chapter 16, I think, is proof that Shaul himself did not consider this particular commandment, this mitzvah, unimportant for followers of Yeshua. And that's the point I'm trying to highlight by bringing this verse out in the discussions that Christians have with Messianics. I don't think Paul is trying to minimize circumcision in and of itself. That's the point I'm trying to make. And I think that's the point that many Christians try to emphasize when they discuss Paul's views of Torah with me. They try to tell me, well, look, see, Paul didn't think circumcision was very important. That's why he didn't have Timothy circumcised. I'm sorry, why he didn't have Titus circumcised, etc., etc. I go on to say, what is more, that Shaul did not view circumcision as equal to conversion can be deduced by his comments in Galatians chapter 5 coming up later on, right? And I think this Greek word anankadzo shows up a total of 9 times in the Apostolic Scriptures. And if you look at footnote number 78, I've got the listing there for you. It shows up many, many times in the Gospels and then Book of Acts. And then we see it here in Galatians. And we're going to see it here in Galatians again a few more times, this force, anankadzo. So, for our immediate interest, I go on to conclude for this verse, for our immediate interest, it is used twice more in this letter from Paul, Galatians 2:14 we're going to see, and we'll see it again in Galatians 6:12, and once in Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. Interesting by association, I believe, is how Paul uses this word in Acts 26:11, when Paul describes his former zeal to, quote, compel, that's the same Greek word anankadzo, to compel, in quote, the followers of the way to blaspheme, right? So, the bottom line is, for this verse, I don't think that Paul is trying to minimize circumcision in and of itself, especially for believers of the community, believers in Yeshua. I think instead what Paul's simply trying to do is show circumcision's proper value and proper place within the covenant of God. And that is, we're going to find out later on that Paul does not agree with his current Jewish counterparts in that circumcision is the sign of Jewish identity. Paul does not believe that circumcision is the sign of Jewish identity. I don't think he does. Instead, Paul sees circumcision in a different way. And so that's why Paul's going to withhold it from the Galatians, and Paul's not going to have a problem with Titus refusing to be circumcised. Okay.